Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into a debate that's, well, it's more than just history, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a fundamental clash about health, about disease. Goes way back to the 19th century, but still feels incredibly relevant.
Yeah, definitely. We've been digging into excerpts from a research paper analyzing this tension between biological terrain theory and the classic germ theory.
Two really different ways of looking at why we get sick.
Exactly. So our mission today, unpack it all. The history, the core ideas, what it means now. We want to help you get informed quickly and thoroughly.
Makes sense.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So the core question really is, does sickness come mainly from outside, like an invasion?
Or is it more about the inside, our internal state, allowing things to take hold?
Precisely.
Let's set the scene then. 19th century France, a hotbed of scientific discovery, right? Chemistry, biology.
Exploding, yeah. And right in the middle of it, you get these two major figures developing these, well, competing ideas.
First up, Antoine Béchamp.
Right. Béchamp.
Hmm.
A seriously accomplished scientist, multiple doctorates, chemistry professor.
He did significant work in organic chemistry too, didn't he? The Béchamp production, things like that.
He did, but his real passion, what he spent like decades observing, were these incredibly tiny particles. He saw them everywhere, in biological fluids, even rocks, apparently.
He called them microzymas, small ferments.
Yeah, and his big idea, the microzyme hypothesis, was that these weren't just random specks. He thought they were the fundamental units of life itself.
Wow, like the building blocks.
Exactly. He believed they could survive almost anything, even the death of the host organism, and that they could build tissues, break them down, produce enzymes.
And crucially, they could change.
That's the key to his pleomorphism theory.
Hmm.
See, the common view was a bacterium is a bacterium, fixed form.
Right.
Béchamp said no. He argued a microzyma, depending on the environment the terrain it found itself in, could develop. It could become a bacterium, maybe evolve into a yeast, even a fungus.
So disease, in his view, wasn't an external attack on a healthy body.
Not primarily. He argued that if the body's internal environment, the terrain, became unbalanced, unhealthy, say the pH was off, then the body's own microzymas could become, quote, morbidly evolved. They'd actually generate the pathogens from within.
So the disease arises from the internal state.
That was his core argument, which, put him on a direct collision course with another scientific giant of the time.
Louis Pasteur.
The rivalry was intense, often quite bitter, actually. Pasteur started in chemistry too, but shifted to studying fermentation.
And he proved it was caused by living things, right? Yeast, not just chemicals.
Exactly. Showed yeast growth was linked to fermentation. And then he thought, well, if tiny organisms cause changes in wine or milk.
Could they cause diseases in animals, people?
Precisely. He showed microbes cause silkworm diseases, which was huge economically.
So by the late 1870s,
By 1878, Pasteur was essentially laying down the law. Infectious diseases are caused, quote, essentially and uniquely in the presence of microorganisms. That's the heart of his germ theory.
and his work had very practical, very visible results. Pasteurization, for instance.
Huge public health impact. Heating liquids to kill spoilage microbes. It worked, and it massively boosted his reputation.
So the clash with Béchamp was fundamental.
Yeah.
Pasteur saying germs have fixed forms, monomorphism.
Versus Béchamp saying they change based on the environment. Pleomorphism, and accusations flew back and forth. Plagiarism, suppression of findings. It got ugly.
So why did Pasteur's view win out so decisively, at least initially?
Several big reasons, I think. First, empirical success. Pasteur delivered results you could see and use.
Preventing spoilage, controlling silkworm disease, developing vaccines for anthrax, and famously, rabies.
Right. These were tangible victories, repeatable experiments, compelling evidence for the time.
And he had backing.
Significant backing. The French government supported his silkworm research. Colonial expansion created demand for solutions to tropical diseases. The French Academy of Sciences validated him. Institutions mattered. And then there's the power of simplicity. Germ theory offered a clear reductionist explanation. One germ, one disease.
Which makes intervention seem straightforward, right? Find the germ, kill it, prevent exposure.
Exactly. That simplicity was incredibly powerful for public health. Think sanitation, hygiene campaigns in cities. They were based on this idea, and they worked. Mortality rates dropped dramatically. It was actionable.
And Pasteur himself?
He was brilliant at demonstrating his ideas. Those swan-necked flask experiments disproving spontaneous generation, genius.
Right.
persuasive. He synthesized ideas, validated them, and communicated them effectively.
He became something of a national hero.
Almost mythical status, revolutionary findings, public debates, it all amplified his influence. It was a combination of good science, practical application, strong support, and frankly, good PR.
Fascinating context. Now, while this main battle was raging, there was another key figure, Claude Bernard. He wasn't directly fighting over disease causation, but his ideas were crucial.
Absolutely crucial. Bernard gave us the concept of the milieu intérieur, the internal environment.
The idea that the body maintains its own stable internal conditions, sort of independent of the outside world.
Exactly. A healthy internal environment adapts, preserves balance. We later called it homeostasis. Bernard laid the physiological groundwork.
So he wasn't proposing an alternative disease theory himself.
No, but his work on physiology underpinned the possibility of terrain theory. It emphasized that the body's internal state, pH, nutrition, hydration, all that biochemical balance is fundamental.
Terrain theory then built on that, arguing that this internal state dictates how microbes behave, whether they become pathogenic.
Right. Bernard's work shows the idea of the internal environment's importance was already there in physiology, even before the Béchamp-Pasteur fight really took off. It was about how you interpreted that physiological reality in the context of disease.
Okay. Then there's René Quinton, who took the terrain idea in a very specific, maybe even radical direction.
Oh, definitely radical. Quinton's big idea was using prepared seawater therapeutically.
See,
Yeah. He was a biologist, came to it a bit later in life. His core philosophy was this law of constancy. Kind of challenged Darwin, actually. He argued nature tries to maintain original conditions, especially the internal marine environment.
because life originated in the sea.
That was his thesis.
Hmm.
He believed our extracellular fluid, the liquid bathing our cells, is essentially a biological memory of that primordial ocean.
So if you replenish that internal ocean with something similar,
The carefully collected, specially prepared seawater, adjusted to match the osmotic pressure of blood plasma. He believed it could restore cellular function, support healing. That was his marine plasma therapy.
he had a whole process, right? Specific collection sites, cold sterilization.
Very specific. Deep Atlantic water, certain times. Cold sterile filtration because he thought heat destroyed its vitality. He diluted it to be isotonic, same saltiness as blood. Patented in 1907.
And the dog experiments, I've heard about those.
Ah, yes. The famous and highly controversial claim of replacing a dog's entire blood volume with this isotonic seawater. He said they recovered and lived for years.
Which sounds improbable.
Extremely improbable by modern standards. Lacked peer review, never independently replicated. But back then,
It gained traction.
in early 20th century France, yes, his clinics were popular. He treated hundreds daily, reportedly with success, for things like infant stomach bugs, skin conditions, even prenatal support. His Quinton serum was even listed in the French pharmacopoeia for a time.
So Quinton represents a very focused application of terrain theory, restore the fundamental internal fluid environment.
Exactly. He saw the internal environment as primary. Germs were secondary, opportunistic. A healthy terrain resists. His focus on mineral balance, bioavailability, the holistic view, it was forward-thinking, even if the specific therapy lacked validation.
And his ideas still echo today.
You see echoes in integrative medicine, nutritional therapy, focus on minerals, and there are still seawater-based products sold today. His legacy is more philosophical now, maybe, reminding us that unconventional thinking can spark valuable perspectives.
Right. Now let's bring in Rudolf Virchow, the father of modern pathology.
Mm.
Where did he fit?
Virchow established cellular pathology disease happens at the level of the cell. Omnis cellula cellula, every cell from a cell. Revolutionized how we understood disease processes.
But initially, he wasn't on board with germ theory.
Not at all. He initially thought disease was more about a breakdown of order within cells. There's that famous quote attributed to him.
The one about germs seeking diseased tissue.
Yeah. If I could live my life over again, I would devote it to proving that germs seek their natural habitat disease tissue rather than being the cause of dead tissue. That's pure terrain thinking, the scavenger idea.
But later thinking suggests both were right.
Exactly. The modern view isn't really Virchow or Pasteur, it's Virchow and Pasteur. Disease involves cellular changes and often the presence and action of microbes. It's an interaction, foreshadows the complexity we understand now.
And Virchow also looked beyond the purely biological, didn't he? Social medicine.
Right. He linked social conditions, poverty, sanitation to disease risk, a broader environmental view.
Okay, moving closer to our time. The idea of pleomorphism microbes changing form didn't completely die with Béchamp. Gaston Nessens picked it up.
He did, a Canadian biologist. Developed a special microscope for live blood observation. Claimed he saw tiny units, like Béchamp's microzymas, which he called somatids.
And like Béchamp, he thought they changed form.
Yeah, he observed them going through different cycles based on the internal environment. He linked certain disease cycles to conditions like cancer, again, controversial in the mainstream, but kept the pleomorphism debate alive, emphasizing the microbe-environment interaction.
Modern parallels might include things like prions or studies questioning if blood is truly sterile.
Exactly. Ideas that challenge the simple, fixed view of internal biology.
And another figure deeply influenced by Béchamp was Gunther Enderlein.
Enderlein spent decades on what he called bacterial cyclogeny microbial life cycles, deeply rooted in Béchamp. His main work, Bacterian Cyclogeny, built directly on the microzyma concept.
He also proposed tiny fundamental units.
Protists, or endobionts. Even smaller than cells, living symbiotically within us, he thought.
And his law of cyclogeny.
Described a developmental cycle. From these primitive protists, they could evolve into bacteria, then fungi. Virulence increased as they moved up the cycle.
And crucially, this was influenced by the terrain, specifically pH.
That was his anortatic law. He argued the form and development depended directly on the pH of the surrounding medium. Acidity pushed microbes towards higher, more virulent forms.
But it was reversible.
Yes. Alkalinizing the environment, he claimed, could make these forms decompose back to primitive, harmless stages. That reversibility based on environment is the absolute core of pleomorphism, totally opposite to Pasteur's fixed view.
It really highlights the fundamental disagreement.
It does. And, the sources mention these persistent claims about Pasteur suppressing Béchamp. It speaks to the sociopolitical side of science, whose ideas get funded, validated, accepted, isn't always purely about the data.
So Béchamp's specific microzyma theories were ultimately rejected by the consensus.
Described as empirically disproven for causing disease, yes. But the influence of institutional factors in Pasteur's dominance seems undeniable. And yet, the concepts, the importance of the internal environment from Bernard, Virchow's initial skepticism, they persisted.
Okay, so that's the rich historical backdrop. Let's really nail down the core principles of this biological terrain theory. How exactly is the terrain defined?
Think of it as the body's internal landscape. Its physiological, biochemical state. The soil, the milieu intérieur, the garden metaphor is common.
So it encompasses things like
Nutrition, hydration levels, hormone balance, metabolic function, inflammation levels, immune status, even the microbiome now. It's the internal condition, distinct from just external exposures.
And the theory posits that disease starts here, in the terrain.
Fundamentally, yes. Illness arises from imbalances or dysfunctions within this terrain. These imbalances create a hospitable environment, a haven for disease processes to start.
And microbes, where do they fit in?
Often seen as secondary players or even scavengers, they're attracted to the already weakened or diseased tissue. They're seen more as an effect or a sign of the underlying imbalance rather than the primary instigator.
So a strong, balanced terrain naturally resists pathogens, like healthy soil resists weeds.
That's the core analogy. If the internal ecosystem is robust, pathogens might be present but won't gain a foothold or cause significant illness.
And cellular metabolism is central to this healthy terrain idea.
Absolutely. Things like mitochondrial function, our cellular power plants, they do more than just make energy. They're involved in mineral balance, hormone production.
Dysfunction there is linked to so many chronic diseases.
Exactly. And terrain approaches, like certain diets or fasting, often aim to restore mitochondrial health.
What about pH balance? That comes up a lot.
It's a cornerstone belief in historical terrain theory, the idea. Acidic environment attracts germs. Alkaline repels them. Now, the body tightly regulates blood pH, that's true.
Right. It has to stay in a very narrow range.
But deviations can occur at the cellular or tissue level or within certain fluids, and that can definitely impact enzyme function's cell health. Enderlein's anortatic law directly linked microbial form to pH, so it was an early recognition of the importance of the biochemical environment, even if modern alkaline diets sometimes oversimplify it.
Oxidative stress, too.
Yeah.
Free radicals and antioxidants.
Yeah, metabolism produces reactive oxygen species. ROS. Normally fine, but if the terrain is compromised, poor diet, toxins, stress, these ROS can build up, cause oxidative stress, damage cells. The body's antioxidant defenses get overwhelmed, increases susceptibility.
Nutrient transport, waste removal, also part of the terrain's health.
Crucial. Getting nutrients in efficiently, clearing waste products out effectively. If either breaks down, the terrain suffers. Detoxification protocols and terrain-based approaches often focus on supporting these pathways.
Makes sense. And enzymatic processes, metabolic pathways
For
generally?
the whole network, disruptions anywhere, energy production, synthesis, breakdown contribute to a compromised terrain and potential illness. It's all interconnected.
And underlying much of this, especially historically, is that idea of pleomorphism again.
Central tenet for Béchamp, Nessens, Enderlin, that microbes aren't fixed entities, but can change form and function based on the conditions in the terrain.
Triggered by pH, oxygen, nutrients, toxins.
Exactly. All those internal factors we just discussed. Now, the specific historical claims about microzymas evolving into bacteria were largely dismissed by mainstream science.
But the general concept of microbial adaptability.
That's incredibly relevant today, especially with what we know about epigenetics, the microbiome, gene expression, changes in bacteria. It resonates.
So ultimately, host resistance in terrain theory isn't just about a specific immune response.
No, it's broader. It's the overall state, the vitality of the internal environment. Your unique body terrain, shaped by genetics, diet, lifestyle, stress, everything.
And microbes are attracted to weakness. The scavenger idea.
Yes. The presence of a pathogen isn't enough. The terrain determines the outcome. Why do some people get sick when exposed and others don't? Terrain theory says it's the difference in their internal environment.
This really reframes things away from just attacking the bug.
Completely. It shifts the focus to proactively strengthening the host, building resilience, preventing the garbage from accumulating in the first place, you could say. It's a foundation for preventive medicine.
And those lifestyle interventions, diet, exercise, stress, sleep, become primary tools for terrain maintenance.
Which, interestingly, is where historical terrain advocacy lines up powerfully with modern evidence-based lifestyle medicine. That practical wisdom holds up, regardless of the theoretical disagreements. Cultivating a healthy terrain through lifestyle is beneficial, full stop.
Okay, so that's the terrain perspective. Now let's fully shift to the established paradigm, germ theory, the foundation of conventional medicine.
Its scientific rigor was hugely boosted by Robert Koch and his postulates.
The 4 criteria for proving causation, right?
Exactly, a systematic method. 1. Find the microbe in all sick individuals, but not in healthy ones.
2. Isolate that microbe, grow it in a pure culture.
3. Introduce that cultured microbe into a healthy, susceptible host, and it must cause the same disease.
And 4. Re-isolate the microbe from the newly sick host, and it must be identical to the original.
Provided a robust framework, really advanced the field.
But not without issues, even then, and certainly with hindsight.
Oh, for sure. Exceptions emerged. What about viruses or bacteria you couldn't culture easily? That messes with postulate too.
What about diseases with multiple microbial causes or non-infectious factors?
Challenges postulate 1. And asymptomatic carriers, people who have the microbe but aren't sick, that violates postulate 1 too.
So later discoveries forced modifications. We move beyond a strict single-cause view for many things.
Absolutely. Viruses, prions, the huge role of host factors. It showed the initial model was powerful but incomplete.
And Pasteur's practical contributions, based on germ theory, were immense.
Yeah.
Vaccination.
Progenitor of modern immunology in that sense. He popularized the concept, discovered attenuation weakening a strain for chicken cholera vaccine. The rabies vaccine was a landmark, anthrax too.
Sterilization via pasteurization.
Huge impact on food safety and public health.
And his work inspired Lister's antiseptic surgery.
Directly. Understanding microbes caused wound infections led Lister to use carbolic acid, revolutionized surgery safety, led to aseptic techniques we still rely on. These were massive, life-saving applications.
Cemented germ theory's dominance.
Undeniably. And modern microbiology just exploded from there.
Bacteriology went from basic ID to understanding genetics, strains, host interactions.
Virology came later, needed the tech like electron microscopes, understanding viruses, linking them to cancer, HIV, and now mRNA vaccines for COVID, integrating molecular biology. Amazing progress.
Immunology, too. Pasteur laid groundwork, but our understanding now is vastly more complex.
Oh, yeah. The immune system wasn't even really conceptualized like that in Pasteur's time. Now we understand intricate cell networks, memory, genetic influences on susceptibility.
And then the elephant in the room, Antibiotics.
A monumental achievement of the germ theory paradigm. Fleming's penicillin, then the golden era from the 40s to 60s, discovering most classes we still use.
Transformed healthcare. Infant mortality plummeted, lifespans increased. Surgery, cancer treatment, made much safer.
Indispensable. But here's where the success created its own problem.
Antibiotic resistance.
The dark side of the magic bullet. Overuse, misuse. Bacteria are incredibly adaptable. They mutate, share resistance genes. We've created a global crisis.
And we're in a discovery void, right?
Yeah.
Few new classes since the 80s.
Scary. Resistance means infections become harder, sometimes impossible to treat. More toxic drugs, longer hospital stays, higher costs. It's forcing a focus on antibiotic stewardship.
It really shows how a singular focus, just kill the bug, can have unintended systemic consequences down the line.
It does. And modern microbiology now includes a whole zoo of germs beyond bacteria, fungi, protists, viruses, prions. It's evolved way beyond one bug, one disease.
You know, what's interesting is looking back at germ theory's public health successes.
Like sanitation, clean water.
Yeah. Weren't they, in a way, also improving the terrain, making the environment less hospitable for pathogens?
That's a great point. There was an implicit synergy, reducing exposure, improving living conditions. It strengthened host resistance, too. It wasn't just about avoiding the germ, it was about creating healthier conditions overall, a less fertile garden.
So maybe the perspectives weren't quite as mutually exclusive in practice as they seemed in theory.
Perhaps not, especially at the public health level. Okay, so we have the history, the principles. Where does modern science stand on all this? Is it still a battle?
Or is something else emerging?
This is where it gets really fascinating. Contemporary research isn't picking a winner. It's actually bridging the divide, showing it's much more about interplay.
And the microbiome has to be front and center here.
It's absolutely transformative. The idea that our bodies are sterile, gone. We're ecosystems, trillions of microbes. And this microbiome isn't just sitting there passively.
It's a crucial part of our biological terrain.
Totally. It influences immunity, metabolism, nutrient absorption, even our moods. And critically, the health and balance of this internal community dramatically affect how we respond to potential pathogens.
So a healthy microbiome enhances host resistance.
Significantly, it's a dynamic interface between our own physiology and the microbial world, both inside and out. This leads to concepts like the germ-terrain duality theory.
Meaning disease isn't just the germ or just the terrain, but the interaction between them.
Exactly. Between the external challenge and the integrity of our internal environment, including our resident microbes, it elegantly harmonizes the two historical perspectives.
And it highlights why Koch's postulates have limitations in this complex picture.
For sure. The body isn't a sterile backdrop, and you can't easily isolate and culture everything in our complex internal ecosystem. A purely reductionist view hits a wall there.
Okay, what about epigenetics? How does that fit?
Epigenetics provides a powerful molecular mechanism that validates a core terrain principle. It shows how our environment can change gene expression without changing the DNA code itself.
Things like diet, stress, toxins.
Yes. They can chemically tag DNA or associated proteins, effectively switching genes on or off. Genes involved in inflammation, detoxification, cell repair.
So the internal environment, the terrain, directly influences how our genes function. It's not just fixed destiny.
Precisely. It provides that concrete link between the macroscopic concept of terrain, lifestyle exposures, and microscopic cellular function, gene expression. It's molecular proof that the environment matters deeply at the genetic level.
And new tools are helping us see this complexity. Metabolomics, systems biology.
Big time. Metabolomics lets us map out the biochemical landscape, the metabolites present, the pathways active. It gives us a snapshot of the terrain's actual biochemical state, revealing imbalances linked to disease.
And systems biology takes an even bigger picture view.
It does. Integrates vast amounts of data genomics, metabolomics, proteomics, clinical data to understand how all the parts interact as a network. Not just individual components, but the emergent properties of the whole system.
So these tools allow us to analyze that complex interplay that terrain theory was hinting at.
Exactly. They provide a way to understand how metabolic imbalances, a compromised terrain, might create conditions ripe for disease, and how microbes interact within that system. It moves beyond single-cause thinking.
Which seems essential, given the rise of chronic diseases.
Absolutely. Heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, many cancers. They aren't typically caused by a single germ, they're multifactorial.
Complex interplay of genetics, lifestyle, environment.
which is exactly what modern epidemiology models like the web of causation try to capture. Disease results from multiple contributing factors coming together. This view aligns much more closely with terrain's systemic perspective than with strict linear germ causation.
The shift in dominant disease types necessitates a shift in our causal models.
It really does. The historical debate partly reflected the kind of diseases they were primarily dealing with versus what dominates now. We need models that embrace complexity.
This brings us back to that core methodological tension, reductionism versus holism.
Germ theory excelled because reductionism works well for finding specific targets for acute infectious diseases. Break it down, find the bug, kill the bug. Simple, actionable.
But the critique is it can miss the bigger picture, the interactions, the underlying conditions.
While holism, the terrain approach, tried to grasp the whole system, the interconnectedness, symptoms as signals of deeper imbalance.
But it was criticized for being perhaps too complex, vague, harder to test rigorously with the tools of the time.
Right. But today, science is increasingly seeing them as complementary. We need the detailed analysis from reductionist approaches within the broader context provided by holistic systems thinking. Systems biology is the bridge.
So germ theory's historical success was partly its simplicity fitting the scientific context.
And that simplicity, while powerful, might have inadvertently become a barrier to fully embracing the complexity needed for chronic diseases.
Okay, so how does all this translate into clinical practice today? What do terrain-based approaches actually look like?
They prioritize optimizing that internal environment, restoring balance. So you see things like nutritional medicine or orthomolecular medicine.
Using diet, supplements, vitamins, minerals to correct biochemical imbalances.
Exactly. Optimizing the molecular environment. Dietary changes are key whole foods, maybe reducing sugar, sometimes aiming for alkaline-forming foods based on that historical pH idea.
Detoxification strategies also seem common.
Yeah, the aim is to reduce the perceived toxic load from environmental exposures, pesticides, plastics, pollutants, and support the body's natural elimination pathways like the liver and kidneys.
And those lifestyle interventions we mentioned.
Foundational. Exercise. Stress management techniques like meditation or yoga, ensuring adequate sleep. These are seen as crucial for strengthening the body's resilience, managing inflammation, balancing hormones, basically, cultivating a healthy terrain.
It connects back to that scavenger idea, focus on strengthening the host, making the environment inhospitable to disease.
Precisely. It's a proactive, preventive framework focused on building resilience from the inside out. And again, these lifestyle factors are heavily backed by mainstream evidence now, regardless of theory.
Okay. And conventional medicine still largely guided by germ theory.
Primarily focused on direct intervention. Antimicrobials, antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals remain critical tools despite the resistance challenge.
Vaccination programs are huge, preventing specific infections by stimulating targeted immunity.
A cornerstone of public health, undeniably. Surgical interventions rely heavily on aseptic techniques derived from germ theory understanding.
And pharmaceuticals targeting specific disease pathways or symptoms.
Highly effective for managing acute conditions and symptoms. Terrain proponents might argue that for chronic issues, this can sometimes mask underlying problems without fixing the root terrain imbalance, but they are powerful tools.
But increasingly, we're seeing integrative approaches emerge, combining perspectives.
Yes, it's definitely a growing trend, recognizing it doesn't have to be strictly either, it can be both hand.
Functional medicine seems like a prime example.
It really aligns with terrain principles. Functional medicine practitioners assess the individual's unique terrain genetics, microbiome, immune function, hormones, metabolic status, lifestyle, exposures.
And create personalized plans.
Exactly. To restore balance, address root causes like nutrient deficiencies or toxic load, support organ function, often focusing on things like gut health and mitochondrial function. It's very terrain-focused.
Naturopathic medicine, too, with its emphasis on supporting self-healing.
Very much so. Using diet, lifestyle, natural therapies to strengthen the body's vitality and make the internal environment less conducive to illness.
So the holistic health perspective becomes: use targeted conventional tools when necessary, but focus fundamentally on building and maintaining a robust internal terrain.
That's the essence of integration. Support the microbiome, optimize nutrition, manage stress, ensure good sleep, reduce toxic exposures, build resilience, then, if an acute challenge requires it, use the appropriate conventional intervention. Health is seen as a dynamic balance.
And the limitations of the purely conventional model, rising chronic disease, antibiotic resistance are pushing this integration.
There's a strong imperative both for health outcomes and economics. The pure kill the bug or manage the symptom approach has limits for the complex chronic conditions prevalent today. There's growing demand for prevention, risk reduction, and addressing root causes, essentially, for cultivating healthier terrains.
But reflecting on the philosophical underpinnings helps make sense of why this debate persisted and why integration is happening now.
Yeah, that core tension, reductionism versus holism. Simple linear cause-effect versus complex multifactorial causation.
Germ theory fit the reductionist linear model well, perfect for acute infections. Terrain theory leaned holistic and multifactorial.
And as we've discussed, modern health challenges, especially chronic diseases, fit the multifactorial model much better. Modern epidemiology reflects this.
You could see it through Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift idea. Germ theory was the dominant paradigm.
Hugely successful based on the evidence, tech, and needs of its time.
Terrain theory was the alternative, maybe seen as an anomaly. Its core ideas harder to test or integrate back then.
But now, the limitations of the dominant paradigm in dealing with chronic disease are creating those anomalies Kuhn talked about. And new research, microbiome, epigenetics, systems biology is providing evidence that supports core terrain concepts.
Creating a crisis that necessitates change, either a full shift or, more likely, an integration.
Exactly, a germ-terrain duality. The very success and simplicity of germ theory might have slowed the embrace of complexity, but the current landscape seems ripe for this kind of evolution in medical thinking.
Which brings us right up to the modern synthesis and where things are heading. Science isn't picking sides, it's integrating.
Microbiome research is probably the most powerful bridge. It completely reframes our relationship with microbes. They're not just invaders, they're integral components of our terrain.
Influencing immunity, metabolism, the health of our internal ecosystem affects susceptibility to external pathogens.
It perfectly blends the two ideas, acknowledges the importance of germs, both resident and external, and the critical role of the host environment, the terrain. Supports that germ-terrain duality idea.
Environmental medicine also fits neatly here, right? How external factors impact the internal terrain.
Absolutely. Environmental toxins, pollution, pesticides, heavy metals disrupt the internal balance, increase inflammation, burden detoxification systems. Terrain approaches often emphasize minimizing exposure and supporting detox.
Even things like electromagnetic fields are being researched as potential environmental stressors impacting the terrain.
And fundamentally, lifestyle factors, diet, exercise, stress, sleep, are critical environmental inputs that shape our internal terrain and susceptibility. Modifiable factors driving imbalance.
Personalized medicine seems like the practical application of all this.
It really does. It embodies the terrain principle of individual uniqueness. Our genetics influence our susceptibility, how we respond to diet, drugs, environmental factors. We each have a unique body terrain.
So pharmacogenomics tailoring drugs based on genetics is part of this.
Yes, and integrating genetic predispositions with lifestyle, environment, and microbiome data allows for truly individualized health strategies. It moves way beyond one size fits all.
It feels like the ultimate terrain-focused approach. Analyze the individual's entire system to optimize their specific terrain, like that Hippocrates quote.
More important to know what sort of person has a disease than disease type. Personalized medicine aims to do just that.
And systems biology provides the framework to handle all this complexity.
It's the toolkit. Taking that big picture view, integrating diverse data streams, omics, clinical records, wearables to model the network of networks.
Allows us to understand the emergent properties, the interactions, not just the parts.
Exactly. It helps decipher the complex interplay between host factors, terrain, and microbial or environmental challenges, germs exposures. It bridges reductionism and holism by analyzing the parts within their dynamic interactive context.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. The historical dichotomy. It's dissolving.
It's becoming much more nuanced. Germ theory gave us revolutionary tools, vaccines, sanitation, antimicrobials, incredibly powerful reductionist, actionable, huge successes, but limitations too, especially with chronic disease and resistance.
Biological terrain theory, the holistic counter-narrative, had specific claims like pleomorphism, largely unvalidated in their original form, but its core premise.
The critical importance of the internal environment, the host state, that's being strongly validated by modern science. Figures like Bernard and Virchow hinted at this complexity early on.
In modern science, microbiome, epigenetics, metabolomics, systems biology forces a synthesis.
It compels it. It shows us external pathogens and internal host environment are both critical and deeply interconnected.
The historical simplicity that drove germ theory's success became a barrier to tackling complexity.
Arguably, yes. And the limitations of the purely germ-focused approach, particularly economically and socially with chronic disease burdens, are driving the reevaluation and integration now.
Personalized medicine seemed to embody this shift towards a more holistic, patient-centric model tailored to the individual terrain.
It does. So the conclusion isn't about a winner, it's about integration, a germ-terrain duality.
Understanding that complex interplay is key for the future.
Absolutely. Leveraging systems biology, personalized medicine, environmental health, that's how we develop more comprehensive, effective, and sustainable health strategies moving forward. What's fascinating here is how this century-old debate is being completely reshaped by, cutting-edge 21st century science, genomics, microbiome research.
It's a great reminder that science isn't static, right? It evolves.
Exactly. It's a process of refinement, not just fixed dogma. What seem like settled questions can reopen with new tools and perspectives. If we connect this to the bigger picture, well, it seems pretty clear that future health strategies have to look beyond just finding a magic bullet for a specific bug or symptom.
It's about understanding the whole system.
The dynamic, interconnected system of the body, its resident microbes, and its environment. Optimizing the whole system, which this raises an important question, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about.
Yeah.
How does understanding this complex interplay between the germs all around and inside us and the actual state of our own internal terrain, how does that change the way you think about staying healthy day to day?
That's a great question to ponder.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.